Hello and welcome to all the ghouls and vampires out there. I'm Joe, here with Ms. McCall Stan.
Hello and greetings.
And today we continue our long-awaited Solomon Kane podcast. Naturally not the book club, but the movie set of videos. The next book club video will be coming out soon. Don't worry. We actually have to get it out before the middle of September because, well, I want to make sure we have two. Well, I want to get that finished before the end of September. And maybe record another book club for October. Anyways, that aside, Solomon Kane, it's revealed, has been hiding in a monastery for about a year as we jump forward 1 year later, as you can see from the current image on the screen. A novice is guided into his chambers, which is a rather haunted-seeming location, which this room looks terrifying with really dark images in it, with a lot of books and whatnot. And Solomon is busy washing his hands, having apparently just freshly woken from a really bad dream. And he asks who the novice is, and that's apparently Brother Thomas. It's his brother or something. And apparently since his disappearance a year ago, Solomon has returned to England and decided he wants to join one of the few remaining Catholic monasteries, because one has to bear in mind, at this time, after the reign of the Tudors, Catholicism is on the retreat and is being persecuted throughout England due to, first, the depraved Henry VIII, who got angry that the Catholic priests were kind of unsure about the legality of his divorce to Catherine of Aragon. And then when they seemed, well, yeah, there was all sorts of stuff with that. And then years later, you had Elizabeth Tudor, who hated them and slaughtered them by the tens of thousands for almost no other reason than they're Catholics. And we got to bear in mind, although she's got great PR, Elizabeth was a bloodthirsty tyrant over England.
She was a Tudor.
Yeah, it goes without saying with them. But that said, that's not to say that James and Charles were all that much more fun for Great Britain. They could be no less violent than Elizabeth and no less cruel. And for all intents and purposes, they basically ruled as the Tudors had before them, which is why you got a civil war. They did it to themselves, really. Well, except they did worse because they were originally Scottish and they decided that they didn't want to be Scottish anymore. Which they could have at least fallen back onto Scotland if they hadn't decided to act like Tudors towards Scotland. But as for Solomon, he's in one of the few remaining Catholic monasteries. And he's trying to become a monk there, which distresses some of the local monks. That said, they're currently doing pretty well financially because Solomon gave his entire fortune to them, which was considerable. So now they should be able to do fine on their own. But his only request has been that they let him into the order and that he be allowed to live out the remaining days he has left in peace and quiet, praying to God and begging for forgiveness. As Christians, we know what their duty is. They actually have to accept him. And they actually have to give him a habit and recognize him as a monk. But they won't. And they don't. Because they fear the violence he once was guilty of. Now that they have their money, they see it as, why should we keep him? So that we see that these monks aren't exactly, on one side, they are self-serving. But on the other hand, the monks are, well, the abbot makes no secret that he basically plundered him for his treasures and is, all right, get out. Now, that said, the priest has been having, well, not the priest, the abbot has been having some bad dreams too and fears them. So he's also nervous about what's hunting Solomon. And Solomon did not sell his case very well when he ended up saying, yeah, I'm being hunted like an animal by forces of darkness. But Solomon states the only thing that gives him peace is the prayers and the sanctuary given to him by the church. And that all he wants is to become a monk. And he said, well, why don't you just go home? Home? I don't have a home. Well, you're of noble birth. You told me in confession. Well, it's not specified that the priest, the abbot found out through confession, but it's obvious if you read between the lines that Solomon confessed everything he's ever done to this abbot. So this abbot basically just tells him, go home. I don't have a home. Well, why don't you go cry to daddy? You're rich. But Solomon is disinherited and was, as far as he knows, if he goes back, he'll be killed. So this is a case where he cannot go back, but he's told, just go home. And even then, even if he can go back, it's his choice. And the abbot is basically saying, I don't care. I have your money. What do I care about you? So this abbot is not very pious or good. In a way, I wonder what the difference is between him and the brigands who later try to rob Solomon. The difference is this priest is much more successful at it. He's taken everything Solomon has, and now he's basically saying, okay, get out, you're done here. And what's interesting is how Solomon Kane looks utterly heartbroken and destroyed, which is sad. And no wonder he becomes a Protestant again, because the Catholics do him no good. And I say that despite being a French Catholic. But my view is, if the church turns on its supplicants, then the church must be destroyed, because it has stopped abiding by the values that it's supposed to serve. And Solomon Kane here is a case in point of the church really ought to be doing everything it can to just keep him as long as possible. Why? He's someone who's returned. He's basically a prodigal son. He has spent his life in war and causing all sorts of mayhem and trouble. Came begging and said, all right, I'll give everything. Can I just become a monk? They ought to have been begging him to become a monk. Now, let's just compare this real quick to Pillars of the Earth. How do you think Prior Philip would have reacted? Philip would have tried to refuse as much of the wealth as possible and would have begged Solomon to take monastic vows. Although the difference is Prior Philip, because of his familiarity with Solomon's education, would have probably started grooming him as the next abbot.
He would have lost his cool against
this abbot. But it's the difference between a truly pious character who lives by the values he espouses and one who doesn't. But at the same time, you get a sense of fear that the abbot knows there's a darkness that's looming over Solomon, and he fears it more than he fears displeasing his own God. So that his fears are ultimately of the material world, which is not very monkly of him, or priestly. It's revealed by the abbot that, well, I was told to cast him out in a dream. But it's obvious it's not God who was whispering to him in his dream, given that in the brief scene before it, he's shown to be afraid when discussing his dreams. Yeah. And he justifies his decision with, well, not everyone finds their redemption in peace and solitude here. So I'm actually doing him a favor, which this is the textbook case of how a narcissist justifies his actions. Oh, well, I may profit from this act, but, the guy's not losing out either. Yeah, sure, bucko. And you didn't profit financially from this at all, did you? So, yeah, the movie does a great job showcasing a corrupt priest. And I'd say corrupt priest because that's a archetype in a lot of literature. But on the other hand, you have the self-justification of this abbot, which is very realistic. He's not a sympathetic character in this film. But what's so fascinating is that he is right in a way in that Solomon Kane's best redemption lies outside the monastery. Solomon Kane will ultimately find redemption through the use of his sword. And I'm going to argue, yeah, the priest did him a favor to long term, but it's not like the priest was doing it because he had any kind of moral intentions. He did it out of selfishness and cowardice.
Yeah, because even though we could see that there's a part of Solomon that was running away from his problem.
But on the other hand, so is the priest, or at least the abbot, I should say. The abbot is running away from his own responsibilities. The difference is Solomon Kane justifying things. He's saying, I find peace in prayer and in this monastery. That's not a lie. Whereas the abbot's running away from his obligations and saying, well, see, I'm doing everyone a favor. The difference is that Solomon Kane is not a hypocrite about it. The abbot is.
If the abbot really wanted to help Solomon to cast him out, he should have gone with Solomon.
Maybe to an extent. But maybe. I guess your argument would be he should have gone with him to make sure he'd be okay, or at least that, so if he's going to fail morally himself, he should exile himself alongside Solomon. Because if I'm going to withdraw the protection of the church, I'm going to withdraw it for myself as well. And I'm going to go down with you.
Since I'd be a sinner in my own right.
Yeah, okay, I see it. Yeah, you're right.
It's a matter of integrity.
Yeah, but this abbot doesn't have any. And it's a little funny that he managed to rob a pirate captain so efficiently and so well. But where I think I get a little offended by it is he did it in the name of God and claiming that he was doing it in order to help someone else. Moral busybodies who only work for their own profit and at the expense of others drive me bonkers. And this abbot was not a rare breed back in the day. He wasn't. He's cut from the same cloth as, say, Thomas Becket. On the other hand, there were plenty of monks and priests who were sincere in their conviction and whatnot. One from literature that's worth mentioning is Prior Philip. And in more recent times, you had Pope John Paul II, who was very evidently a very sincere priest. So, yeah, you've got all sorts in all organizations and groups. But next time we'll get into the initial exile of Solomon Kane from the Abbey, and hopefully you'll tune in for that, and you'll smash that like and that subscribe button as though you were Solomon Kane taking down one of his enemies.